This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe and practicing social distancing during this uncertain time of the coronavirus pandemic here in the United States and elsewhere. My guest this week is Nate Postlethwait, who runs the popular Instagram page and blog, The Other Side of Saved. He talks about his journey of healing from a lot of religious trauma and other types of trauma, so please be advised that this conversation does include frank discussions of both trauma and abuse, childhood abuse, sexual abuse, lots of different types of things that he has addressed through therapy throughout his life. So please be aware of that while listening to this episode. It's a great conversation, and I'm excited to share it with you. As always, you can support the show by rating it on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, sharing it with your friends, or supporting it via Patreon at patreon.com/evangelicalpod. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. Thank you very much, Jake. Finally, if you enjoyed this show, you may want to check out No Place Like Home. It's a podcast that gets to the heart of climate change through personal stories. Hosts Marianne Hitt and Anna Jane Joyner explore the biggest story of our time from inviting intimate, creative, and surprising angles. From staying sane in the age of climate change to real talk about whether or not our personal choices really matter to saving the planet, No Place Like Home dives into the spiritual, personal, cultural, and emotional dimensions of climate change. They don't shy away from science and politics, but we always bring along our sense of humor, or their sense of humor, and a feisty sense of hope. Their new season is called Bring the Light, which is something that we really need right now. So please check that podcast out wherever you listen to podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or elsewhere. If you are interested in advertising on Evangelical, please reach out at contact@evangelicalpodcast.com. All right, let's get into it. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Evangelical. My guest this week is Nate Postlethwait, creator of the blog, podcast, and Instagram account, The Other Side of Saved. Welcome to the show, Nate.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I'm glad you reached out, and I'm glad we have a chance to talk a bit about your journey. Where I like to start on the show is really from the beginning and get a good sense of where you grew up and what your initial sort of experience with religion was and what your faith of origin was like. So let's start there.
Well, I was born in a manger in the deep South Georgia. Grew up the youngest of 7 kids in a very diehard, mission, faith-based Southern Baptist environment. And my mother grew up in a really religious environment. My dad didn't know anything about religion. And so their coming together was kind of a new offspring of his family line, of him marrying into this new dynamic where they're creating this very righteous life where they have a lot of kids, and my mom makes her daughters dresses, and everything is centered around our church life. We were Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. We were all in as long as I can remember.
So you were always at the church doing something.
Always at the church.
And so were both of your parents involved in that church life, or was it primarily an interest of your mother's, and then, or was your father sort of brought along and learned that part of life?
I think on an emotional level, he was kind of brought along, but as far as discipline and commitment, he was there. I think that she just had a different level of maturity and hunger than he had. Mm-hmm. But they really, as a team, centered their entire life around what it meant to be righteous and honoring God, and the rules. And it's what you think of a Southern Baptist church in the late 70s, early to mid 80s. It's just strict. We're talking about South Georgia, a town of 5,000 people. I eventually moved to central Alabama when I was 10, but both environments were so similar, where everything around religion is about kind of bleeding out, like making sure that you're completely sold out to Christ and you're in His name, but everything was somehow tied into God. There was never anything that was just a normal conversation about life. Everything was centered around religion.
Did you have like religious education, or was religion present even if you went to a public school?
So I went to a public school and religion was not present there, but I think that because we were so insulated in our religion and having Bible study multiple times a week in our home, that we taught very early on that anyone who did not believe like we believed, they were a threat. They were disobeying. They were to be dismissed. They were to be held in your peripheral with a lot of caution because they believe the same way. And, when you're a kid, you believe that and you understand that the best way that a kid can, but it's really difficult to make actual connection. And the bizarre part was, as a child, I remember looking at other people who, like, I remember when MTV came out and people had cable television and watched MTV, and I was like, oh my God, they are so rich. Like, that's what I equated to be. We were very poor. We were a very large family, and my mom did not work. She worked part-time jobs at different, like during holidays and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was just my dad's income supporting a lot of kids.
Right.
As a kid, when you continually have religion to be your all-encompassing identity, you're still surrounded by other people who have a lot more quality self-esteem and assurance that you don't have, and they don't have religion. And I picked up on that to a certain degree very early on, but I still had that bend in my mind of thinking they're lost and I'm found, I'm saved, I'm secure.
So do you think that in retrospect, was your sort of social circle limited to those people that were not lost? Like as far as who your family associated with or who you became friends with? Or did you have exposure to people sort of outside of that sphere of life?
I would definitely say that it was limited, but even the exposure that we did have would always be extreme circumstances, a lot of poverty, a lot of trauma. When I think back, and I've talked about this a lot in therapy, to the stuff that I saw as a kid while being in church 3 times a week, it's just amazing that collision can be in the same group of, holy shit, we were super religious, super devout, yet there was so much trauma. When I was still exposed to so much other things that you think in your head, how did those two go hand in hand? And that's what took me a long time to figure out, but I finally got a grasp on it.
Yeah, and that's definitely a big part of your story, right? And that's as far as recognizing what you went through was traumatic in some aspects. And this is something you talk about on your podcast and other places. You started to experience those things early on.
Yeah. I think I'm 42 years old now, and I started going to therapy when I was 18. And I went to therapy because I felt like I was such a deficit as a human, because I'd grown up hearing about this God that was a savior for so long. And at that point, I had tried everything that I knew to do to rid myself of shame and be righteous or feel on the inside. I wanted my soul. I wanted what existed inside of me to match doctrine. And I could not get there. And I blamed myself for that. I blamed myself for always feeling like I can't present to the gospel, to Christianity, what they're asking of me. There's not enough in me. There's too much shame. But the very first time I really ever shared with a therapist, I didn't know to call it, sexual abuse, but there was sexual abuse that started as early as 6 years old from a neighbor that went on for a couple of years. And they're probably the most traumatic. I was 12 years old, and there was just a very unfortunate timing where I was introduced to this 36-year-old pedophile who went through the full grooming process and really, I think, could sense quite a ways away. This is a very vulnerable child. This is a child that feels very out of place, and I was an easy target. And in addition to that, there was a lot of abuse that went on in our home. At one point, I was removed from my parents' home while they were super active in their church, but there was an investigation over a lot of the abuse that went on with me and my father. So you've got this kid who everything in my world that was good was about God.
Mm.
Everything that had to do with being a Christian or finding peace had to do with being gutted from the core.
Right.
To become something that matches scripture or matches doctrine.
Right. That whole he must increase and I must decrease sort of thinking. Yeah.
Or, what a privilege to suffer and to share the fellowship of his sufferings. And you think about a young 6-year-old who's hearing those messages and how complicated that is, where his nervous system has been hijacked from sexual abuse. He has all of this trauma living inside of his body. He is doing everything that he can to pull everything together on a daily basis to make sure that he is presentable and feels loved, while on the inside he is falling apart because all of the security that a kid's supposed to have has been systematically, strategically removed. And he's this kind of walking hollow shell looking for anything to lead him to the next path.
I'm sorry that all happened to you. It's terrible. And as an interviewer, I feel like I feel terrible just having to ask you another question.
Know this, and I always say this in these interviews. If anything, I'm extremely comfortable talking about these things. I started working on this 24 years ago, and haven't talked about it enough. And my intent, I need zero validation about my story. I need the people who are hurting the most, who are quiet, alone, believing that they somehow created the shame that they've experienced or created the traumatic experience. I need them to hear the story,
right,
so that they can start a process to recognize this has nothing to do with me. Right. So I'm open game and very comfortable in being able to talk about these things.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I do have more questions. And so I want to return to how you brought up shame, and hear from you a little bit about how that shame was reinforced by the sort of religious experiences that you had and the religious teachings and communities that you were a part of. Because I think that is something that's really resonant with a lot of listeners, a lot of people that come from fundamentalist or even more general, less hardline types of evangelicalism. This sense that, as you said, that everything that's what really stood out was you said everything that was good was ascribed to God, and everything that's bad is ascribed to you. Being in a place where you're in a home where you're experiencing these traumas and have been subject to these, been abused. How did that interact with all of these things that, as you said, your body and your mind are processing? And then you're told that the only good thing in the universe is what God does or who God is.
Sure. So think about, we know the message that we all got as kids that grew up in the evangelical church. And I would say if you start with masculinity, to be a boy or a man, a Christian man, it's very specific that means that you are in love with a woman and you're her spiritual leader and you're stronger than her and you work and she doesn't, she stays home with your kids. It means that you are you have a deeper insight and understanding. You are following Christ and being godly. When you think about all of those things, they are, it's not just like, hey, if you're able to do these things, then you can check the box and be satisfied in the sight of God. It's also, however, if you are not these things, you go to hell. You are basically dismissed. And so, as a very young child, I remember the first time I heard the word gay, and the way that it was described was pretty horrific. And I remember thinking to myself, that relates to me somehow. Not what they're explaining, but the gay thing. Like, I know that that somehow relates to me. And based on what they're saying, their reaction is so visceral that I have to rearrange that somehow. And that process started when I was 6 years old.
Wow.
So again, yeah, again, you think about, you don't realize at 6 or 8 or 10 that what you're actually trying to do is run from trauma that's living inside your body. You're trying so hard to be found. But I can safely say that in the context of evangelical Christianity, I was never seen. There was nothing about me that was validated or seen. I was a very tender-hearted kid who very compassionate towards the underdog, and that's just not what I was taught being a man of God is. So
yeah, and gotta toughen up. Don't be so sensitive.
toughen up. And again, if you cannot reach those levels, that speaks volumes about your worth.
Yeah, let's talk about that sense of like evangelical masculinity and trying to fit in with other guys in that space. Because yeah, I was a sensitive kid too. Surprise, surprise. And that was something that I felt I sort of bristled against. And I think that Midwestern men of, they're supposed to be, at least what was modeled or what I saw in my churches and things like that, they were supposed to be stoic and reserved and just all these different markers that I didn't necessarily, I wasn't against them, but it was just more like I wasn't interested. So like, what was that? I mean, you had this aspect of also wrestling with your sexuality and relating to that in a negative way at that point in your life. But even just amongst other men, what was that like for you?
Well, first, I want to ask you, when you're talking about your experience and you had no interest, were you intimidated by what it meant, or were you able to put it in a category and just say, yeah, that's just not for me, and I'm okay being.
That's a good question. There were certain things that I wasn't able to do because so the main one is that once I got to sixth grade, I couldn't play football because I have epilepsy, and my doctors just said no way. Like you cannot play a contact sport. Basically, that sort of shut off that part of like a formative part of middle school and high school for me. And then actually that was when I became really nerdy and got into like youth group shit and Star Wars,
Yeah.
So for me, it was like I wasn't necessarily drawn to those things, and I felt a little bit lacking for that. That would nag at me, but it took a while until I could find people that I felt, were interested in the same things. Because, and all that finding your in group or whatever, it's crucial during those periods, just like it's important later on in life. So yeah. So,
but you were secure within who you were and did.
Self-esteem is a lifelong problem for me. So I didn't necessarily think I was secure. I was just very in my head. My self-worth, I still felt a little, lacking because I was like, pudgy and not athletic, and I felt like that was a big problem. that I wasn't those things. So for me, that was a huge insecurity.
Who was, and I promise I'm going to answer your question. Who was the key guy that represented all of it? Of just like that guy, he's got the God thing down, he's got the looks, he's got the athletic ability, he's
Oh, you mean like a peer?
yeah, it's like the person that the church doted on and was like, this is the one. Jesus reincarnated.
I've got a kid in mind. His first name was Jeff, and he was the shit for sure. And on top of that was like also artistic, and like he just had every box was checked. At least at that point in life, for sure. So there was a guy, and he went to the same church as me, and all those sorts of things.
I just think that we all have some of those people, and those people are celebrated based on their performance quite a bit, and leaves the rest of us kind of clamoring at being able to perform like that person and betray ourselves in order to get the affirmation that we so desperately want, that says we are okay and we are worth celebrating too.
Right. Yeah.
My interaction, I will say that I was so stifled, stunted by knowing that there was this thing inside of me. And I say knowing, I was so deep in denial to ever say this means that I'm gay. There wasn't enough oxygen in my world to come to that conclusion. And so I observed, and I desperately wanted to be seen in that light of this is the epitome of masculinity. And I went down that route with work, humor, success, but really like the epitome of evangelical. I mean, like the epitome of YWAM at 18, like just the true evangelical. And that was a way to kind of inch my way and overcompensate for this internal dialogue that's going on that's scaring me to no end, and I don't have resources to know how to process or appreciate or affirm. And so I overcompensate by being like the true evangelical.
Yeah, as is true evangelical. YWAM right at 18. You said that's also right around the time you started therapy. Is this what sort of begins that sort of process of starting to reckon with this very intense childhood and adolescence? Is just going by the timeline you have of YWAM at 18, did you start therapy around the same time as well?
Right when I got done, there was an incident on the mission field where one of the spiritual leaders, one of the group leaders at YWAM, gave me some very unfortunate advice. I had never lived in a kind of a safe, structured environment before. So for the first time in my life at 18, I'm going to bed at the same time every night. I'm waking up at the same time every morning. And I took that time to settle for the first time. And 2 months in, I had what I call my first breakdown. And it was because that stability and that structure gave me room to let stuff come to the surface. And my roommate in the middle of the night went and got our dorm dad and said, this guy is really upset. You need to come get him. And so he took me down to where we do our classes. And that was the first time I shared what happened to me at 12 and 13 by this pedophile. And before I say this, let me preface. The guy that gave me the advice that he did was so uneducated. I just have never had like harmful feelings towards him. What he said was so ignorant and did so much damage, but he believed that. He was not trying to harm. He was that uneducated. But I tell him this story. It's the first time I'd ever shared someone about being abused, and I tell him the story, and his response was that I needed to repent for being involved in homosexuality. Yeah, if you think about this timeline of this little boy who doesn't have security in anything other than performance. I believed him wholeheartedly with every fiber of my being. His message matched the shame that I felt. And so I bought it. There was nothing in me that had a reflex and thought, what the hell is this guy saying? I full throttle thought he's absolutely right. And what's so disgusting about that is anyone who has ever had any type of sexual assault or sexual harm done to them, the shame is instant. Our bodies are not meant to know how to process sexual assault. And because it's intimate and because it's such a sacred thing to ever experience and encounter any type with another human, because we either respond to it or it happens and it's now registered in our body because we don't know what to do with it, the most common thing is to turn that into shame and say, clearly, I did this. We know how to work with shame. We don't know how to work with trauma. So 18 years old, what led me to therapy was thinking, oh my God, I'm so sorry, God. And then, the other thing that's so infuriating is what happened to me at 12 and 13 has nothing to do with sexuality. So when people make comments and say things like, do you think that is why you struggle with your sexuality? And I'm like, well, no, I struggled with my sexuality because of what I was taught by the evangelical church. What he did to me, that wasn't sex and that's not sexuality.
Right. You're right. That's a very dangerous lie that evangelical spaces tell, is that abuse leads to some change in sexual identity or orientation.
I've spoken up quite a bit about that because, number one, so many other people reach out to me and say, no one has ever said this before. And I'm like, isn't that tragic that no one has ever said to you, that is absurd. Being sexually abused doesn't have anything to do with sexual orientation. And that man being homosexual has nothing to do with sexuality. Him being a pedophile is about control. That has nothing to do with sexual orientation. So a lot of those things are very blurred. The lack of education is tragic. That conversation with him led me to Christian counseling. My parents put me in conversion therapy right away. I had my whole experience at Love in Action that caused an unbelievable amount of trauma that I feel like I've healed from the best way that I know how, but conversion therapy, my God, it does something to you that is so confusing to know what reality is, and to know what God is and what that means. And it's a pain and it is a darkness that for me has equaled sexual abuse for sure. They're in the same category together because the assault is against something so vulnerable and so sacred. I do these interviews all the time, and when I talk about complex trauma, it's when you have a traumatic experience on top of a traumatic experience on top of a traumatic experience. I was in survival mode all of those years, so there wasn't even room to be saved or have someone come alongside me and say, holy shit, dude, we've got to get your nervous system to stop rattling so you can have a normal life. There wasn't room for any of that. And when I look at all of that, the one thing in my way was Christianity. Like, it literally walled me in to have no access to medicine, a professional therapist with credentials and licenses, books that had to do with trauma. I mean, like, there were so many resources that could have been beneficial, but because I went the Christian route, I lost so many years. And that's why I want other people to know, please trust your instinct. Please trust your instinct and know that none of us are meant to suffer the way that we've suffered under the hands of uneducated evangelicalism. That's just not what we're here for.
Right. Yeah. And that's such a good point, that so often, like, people have these nagging doubts, and you're taught to not listen to your doubts. But you feel this sense of pain, or you feel this sense of or anger, or whatever signal you're sending to yourself. You're right. Like, those are good signals to listen to and to follow through on. So what was the crack in that wall that Christianity and evangelical Christianity had put up around your recovery? What got you on a path that let you break through that wall and start to really work on addressing the trauma that you had undergone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I spent 18 to 31 in some form of Christian therapy, conversion therapy. The therapist that I saw while I lived in Nashville was kind of kind of known as the liberal Christian. He was in demand, and several of my friends had gone to him, and I went to him when I was 23 or 24 years old, and just kind of laid my story on the line in our very first session, and just said, "This is what I've experienced. This is where I'm at now. Can you help me?" And I was just desperate. And he said, "Yeah." And I believe that in his mind, he was doing me a favor by inviting me to his home for dinner and inviting me to like a men's group that he was in, and just a lot of really inappropriate things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it was $200 an hour, which to this day I'm really stupid. But I look back at that, and he certainly did a lot of damage around my view of sexuality. But when I was 31 years old, I had my first encounter with full-on reality, where I had flashbacks of additional abuse that happened when I was a kid, and there were all of these details and stories that came back to me. And I'd always, through all of those years, I had this thing that I would often say to close friends and to my therapist: there's a piece of my story that I'm missing, and I don't know what it is. And my therapist would say, your brain and your heart will work together and reveal it at the right time when they know that it's safe. And that time was December of 2009. And I had all of these memories come back, and I had a lot of anxiety because for the first time, all of these blanks were filled in, where I thought, no wonder I've wrestled with sex addiction. Like, oh my God, there was this, and there was this, and there was this, and there were all of these dynamics and all these different things that I'd encountered. It was the first time in my life I considered maybe this wasn't my fault. Maybe the way that you feel is because of stuff that was done to you, and not because you're just a human trash can. And I was waiting. It was right after Christmas. I was waiting for a friend to come back in town from his family trip. And I went to his house that night, and I just shared a lot of the details with him of a lot of the memories, and just putting all of these pieces of different stories together, a lot that I've already told you about tonight. And he asked me for specifics, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that he wanted to understand the gravity of when I say that there was this and this and this. He wanted to understand. And so I told him several of the stories that I remembered. And the look on his face was horror. And I kept saying to him, but I'm not mad. I'm just glad I understand my story. I'm not mad. I'm just glad I understand my story. And Blake, my heart rate was so high and my face was flushed, and I kept saying that over and over. And I left that night. When I got home that night, my body unraveled, and I stopped sleeping, I had just built this beautiful home in downtown Franklin. I went to my partners at a firm that I was part owner of. I was the vice president there, and I resigned. I closed the blinds to my home. I stopped responding to phone calls and emails. I gained 50 pounds and I disappeared from life because I did not have the tools to process the amount of trauma that had happened. And I was obsessed with time. I wanted time to sit still so that I could catch my breath, because all of a sudden there's all of this new information that is basically saying, hey, Nate, heads up, none of this was your fault. And when you recognize the extent that other people went to, parents included, to cause harm, to maintain control, it was too much. It was just too much. It was so dark to recognize their involvement in so much of my abuse. I have this saying, I hate cliches so much. I hate them so much. And when people say everything happens for a reason, my response is, everything does not happen for a reason. Everything happens because people make decisions every day. And some of those decisions include causing a shitload of harm to other people. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason behind it. It is what it is. And the other one is, God will never give you more than you can handle. Well, what does that say about me? Because I had a nervous breakdown. So clearly I couldn't handle it, and it's just so ignorant that people continue to say these things that are so dismissive. Beyond all of the conversion therapy bullshit and all of the inappropriate therapy, the thing that makes me the most angry about this therapist was, from December of 2009 until October of the next year, he let me stay in that condition while encouraging more prayer, more Bible verses, more books. Not once did he say, okay, you're sleeping 2 hours a night. You wake up screaming. You're afraid to sleep in your own bed because that bedroom feels too large. So you sleep in your guest room because you feel safer in there. You have gained 50 pounds. You've stopped working. I mean, anybody with half an ounce of awareness would say, holy shit, this guy is unraveling. I've got to get him help. Mm-hmm. Nothing for 10 months. Nothing. Everything, every tool, every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, all was related to being a stronger Christian. So in October of that year, I found an outpatient treatment center I didn't even know what PTSD was. In my head, PTSD was someone who's gone to the war and they fought, and now if they hear loud noises, they react like that. That was the extent of what I understood. And I got to this treatment center, and the lady, my therapist, gave me her card, and I've never seen so many credentials and licenses in my life. It was her name, comma, LMFT, comma, LCSW, comma, EMDR. I mean, on and on and on. And I was like, this is great. My time there gave me my life back. It was my introduction to reality for the first time. It was so powerful to work through so much of the trauma that was on the surface at the time that I was really wrestling with. But when I left, they were very clear and said, you need to come back for this, you need to come back for this, you need to come back for this. And honestly, Blake, I got back to my home and I looked around and I just thought, I hate this life that I've built. I've got to get out of here. I've got to get as far away from here as I can. And that's when I moved to San Diego, and then started, in 2010, I started EMDR therapy.
And explain what that is for the listeners, because I've I've also heard mention of it, and I do know that it is very helpful for people, but I don't have a great frame of reference for it and what that therapy entails.
I love explaining this to people because I'm a layman and I get to explain it from experience, not the technical. I mean, it's part technical, but I love being able to explain to people like what it actually does to your brain. So
Mm-hmm.
when something traumatic happens, you think about a 7-year-old. No 7-year-old on the planet is born with functioning skills to know how to respond to a situation. And listen, trauma is anything that happens to a person that they experience as traumatic. That is what trauma
Mm-hmm.
is. So you imagine this 7-year-old who has an experience, no tools. And so what you do, what we all do, is we take that experience and we push it on one side of our brain so that it doesn't have movement, because our movement goes left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain. So we stick it on one side of our brain and we push it away. And what we think we've done is we've eliminated that memory and we're building a life and saying, I never ever want to experience that again. What we don't realize is that we are living with it, recreating it day in and day out through our relationships, through our eating habits, through our addictions. Like it is rooted in our brain and it's helping us make all of the bad decisions. EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There are several different forms that they use. Mine has always been the dual fingers, where they hold 2 fingers up in front of your eyes and move them back and forth. You talk quite a bit before doing EMDR and lay the foundation of, say that we're saying, what was it like for 8-year-old Nate to hear the yelling before someone came into his room to abuse him? And we're talking about that, we're laying the foundation. And then when you do the EMDR and you've got the fingers moving in front of your eyes, you're sitting still. And what that does is it taps into that memory. So where it's been stuck all of that time, you poke a hole in it, and then you pull a little bit of it, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more, and all of a sudden it's got left brain, right brain, left brain, right brain. And so say I'm doing that at 34 years old. At 34, I'm able to provide perspective, understanding, healing to that young boy that he wasn't able to get himself because it just wasn't available. I've done over 300 hours of EMDR. It saved my life. I'm a huge advocate. It is not for everyone. There are certain, I know people who have said when I tried it, it was so triggering. I also think it's really important that if you're doing EMDR, you have got to have a strong, safe security with your therapist. That's imperative, because that person's leading you back to the trauma. I don't want to scare people away. I just want to put that disclaimer out there that if you don't have a strong connection with your therapist and feel incredibly safe, please don't try EMDR. Please don't.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's a very, very interesting process and way in which to, use those psychosomatic and bodily things in order to address memories. That's fascinating, and I'm glad it's worked well for you. I want to talk a little bit about how you decided to take all these different experiences you had in healing and pursuing all these elements of therapy after you broke through this wall of evangelical Christianity and a shitty Christian counselor and found good treatment and started to make progress. What eventually led you to want to start sharing these stories and developing this public aspect of your recovery and sharing that recovery? Tell me what led you to that point and why you are passionate about talking about your recovery from trauma.
Sure. So I've always been a hard worker. Because we grew up poor, we had to fend for ourselves in a lot of ways. And I enjoy work, but I've always used success as a buffer and an excuse, kind of a shield, so that when people said, "Why aren't you married?" I'm too busy. The thought of someone believing that I was gay or wrestling with my sexuality terrified me. My closest friends all knew. We talked very openly, as best we could for years about that. But there just was still a deep longing for me. I was hardwired so early to believe that there's this thing that God's going to do where he flips a switch and all of a sudden I am heterosexual. And so even after all of the EMDR therapy, I still didn't come out. And in 2016, I had my moment that was so powerful and so sacred by myself on a Friday night. And I was hurting. And I just felt like, okay, I have done this much work on myself. I don't understand how, after at this point, 18 years of intensive therapy, no social life through my 20s and 30s, no amazing vacations, no, I understand my hobbies, but just like gutting myself, working towards that switch being flipped. And I just got to a place where by myself on a Friday evening in July of 2016, I just thought, I just don't think I can do this anymore. And why haven't I explored at this point, like, what would happen if you explored coming out? What would that be like? Mm-hmm. And it was such a powerful moment to sit, because my coming out is so different to me. I think everybody's coming out is so unique. Mine had very little to do with me being gay. Like, I was very comfortable with that part, very comfortable, very unapologetic. It was recognizing, if you do this, you're going to lose a lot of relationships and you're going to have to grieve for fighting the wrong battle for so long.
Yeah.
And I recognized that that's what kept me closeted. So started the coming out process in that July. The negative experiences just have no impact on me. There was nothing traumatic. Sure enough, people dropped me. There were a lot of angry Christians of, I don't agree. There were people just like, I don't feel any different. People that I saw on a weekly basis, I don't feel any differently, and I understand, and then I never heard from them again. But all of those relationships were replaced with people that are my people, where the relationships just don't take the kind of work. So there was nothing really traumatic about all of that. With that, the positive part was other level positive. The amount of support that I got, the very first person that I came out to was to my closest friend, who to this day is still my closest friend. And he said, I don't know another human who has worked as hard as you have to heal. And I am all for you exploring this and doing whatever it takes to capture life that you enjoy. And that meant the world to me. And so once you start coming out, and all of a sudden at 36, I turned 37 the next month. All of a sudden it's like, I turned 30. I was 38, turned 39 the next month. All of a sudden you're known for the first time. You're actually being honest about who you are for the first time in your life. And of course, in the beginning, in my head, I thought, oh, God is probably furious about this, and I'm just misunderstanding something, and had all of this other kind of psychobabble that went on in my head. But the experience was so powerful that a year later, when I turned 40, my career was at a really unique position where the success was off the charts. It was just stupid success. And, had I stayed for 3 or 4 more years, I could have retired. I had worked so hard to get to that point, but I was barely hanging on. And I kept thinking about this quote that one of my mentors had said is, you can't postpone life for life. Because if you do, once you get there, your heart can't hold that dream. And all I could think was like, if you do this, you've got to do it now. So I sold my home. I sold everything that I own. I bought a bunch of plane tickets, and I left the country for a sabbatical to just go explore the world. I had not done a lot of traveling. and started a blog and podcast while I did that. That was a year and a half ago. And you can't freely travel to countries like Morocco and meet Muslim families and have dinner with them in their homes and still be convinced that you were right about being an evangelical Christian. And if you can, you're not seeing these people. You're not there. You're just not there.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't expect I don't know, the blog and podcast just got shared with people who I think shared it, and it took off, and it's been such a gift. I feel like I found my people, and all I think about is what it was like those 10 months sitting inside that home that was just such a dark place in my life, and thinking to myself, if I survive this, if I do get through this, I'm going to help other people get through this too.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea how many of those people were. I had no idea how many wounded people are walking around with these deep, painful traumas from the evangelical Christian movement, the Catholic Church. I mean, just it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's where I've been really specific from day one in how I've chosen to communicate, very unapologetic, and I don't engage the bullshit either. I just don't have any desire to explain where I'm coming from. I share my message in a way that I think is going to help the people who need to hear it, and the rest who feel imposed or offended, that's not my story. And regardless of their offense, that has nothing to do with the people that have been hurt and need to hear a message that helps them heal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the places that you've found a lot of community and have a lot of exposure is over on Instagram. And this is sort of just something that I think is very interesting, because I am not a very good user of that platform. Like, I started using it primarily to share pictures of my kid, and so my profile has basically been private, but I share all sorts of random thoughts over on Twitter. But it seems like over on Instagram, there is a lot of very interesting accounts, including yours, that really address elements in regards to trauma and counseling and therapy, and sharing different things within, say, a post, and then sharing a bit about your story. And I'm curious, just in the way that people, again, you said you found your people, and you've discovered through sharing your story that there are a lot of other people who have similar experiences. I'm just very curious personally about the way in which that sort of information gets discovered and the way it finds audiences. This show found an audience unexpectedly. Again, me too. I started the show just with the intent of talking to my friends from college that I knew all sort of became more liberal and less evangelical, and understanding why the hell that happened. And then it found this broader interest. So within your experience over on a different platform, like I did a lot of this on Twitter, for example, how have you seen that community arise around a platform like Instagram, which, a lot of people have complicated relationships with because of, whether it feeds into their body image issues, things like that. And then you see this really cool stuff happening, like people talking about how to approach trauma, or doing these different kinds of posts that acknowledge the parts of life that are really worth fighting for and really worth fighting through, but aren't necessarily, picture perfect. So I'd love to hear about how that part of sharing your story has developed.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So when this all started a year and a half ago, I had to hire someone to help me with social media because it just is not my thing. I had deleted my Facebook account for years because it just felt inauthentic and a strain. I didn't enjoy it. So I hired this gal who has become such an amazing friend, and I adore her. So I hired her, and we sat down, and she's like, "Okay, what's your first question?" I was like, "Okay, what is Instagram?" And she said, "Are you serious?" And I was like, "I know that I know that my assistant has an account for me for real estate. I don't know what my name is on there. I don't know like how stuff gets on there." So we had to go through this long process. And so, for me, it was I've just walked away from this career, and my hope is to build a platform. I know that I'm going to eventually become a life coach. I know I've led groups for years. I've done coaching for years. I've done mentoring for years. I knew that that's where I wanted to go, but I also felt like you really need to build a platform in order to make this whole thing work. So during my travel, when I was writing and doing the podcast and doing Instagram, I lasted about 6 months and I got kind of burned out. I felt really exhausted. Stopped traveling, moved to San Diego. And through the course of the last 8, 9 months, I've gone through a layer of healing that I didn't know was possible, where I didn't know that I could ever celebrate. I look in the mirror and I am so grateful for the man that I see and what he fought for, what he fought against. And the message that I shared in the beginning is so different from the message that I share now. Something happened a few months ago where I was just like, fuck it, I'm not tailoring this to anybody. I'm going to say the stuff that I say to myself. I'm going to say the stuff that I say to my addict. I'm going to say the stuff that I say to my inner child. I'm going to talk about trauma. I'm going to talk about sex abuse. I'm going to talk about being an ex-evangelical, like all of these things. I'm going to talk about these things in an authentic way. I get bogged down like everybody with how many likes did that get, and holy shit, this one didn't take off. And I've learned over time to put the information out there and just trust that there's another Nate from 2009 somewhere getting this information. That I think that a lot of the big growth has come from, just people who have larger platforms, finding my work, sharing my work. And that has meant the world to me, to be validated and to have, listen, I'll tell you a huge surprise. Not once did it ever cross my mind that the largest percentage of my followers are therapists, trauma therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers.
Wow.
That never crossed my mind. And these are people who want to help people heal. You can imagine what my view is of the whole therapist industry as a whole. That has been redeeming, and they reach out to me, and I've had many therapists reach out and say, can I consult with you on this or that? And it means the world to me that they respect my voice and know that I had zero training as a therapist, zero certification, but they see someone who's worked so hard and wants to help other people and wants to educate, and their validation has meant so much. But then that also makes me take it so serious, where every damn post I look at and I say to myself, is there something catty on here? Is there drama in here? Is there anything in here that's just to get a rise out of someone? Is this as authentic as it needs to be, and will it reach the people it needs to reach? And I think about that before every post. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't hear from someone that says, you just described something that I've not been able to describe. And that's how this whole thing is built. It's sacred, man. It really has been so beautiful. The stories that I hear from people are so heartbreaking and painful, but they're all trying and they're searching. Something else that I've learned is the unbelievable amount of privilege that I've had to get the help that I've had. I would say 90-something% of my followers have no access to the kind of therapy that, either financially or geographically. Like, it's just not there. So my long-term goal is to continue to build my coaching practice, where eventually My job is just coaching coaches, and I build a nonprofit that gets mental trauma therapy, mental health awareness and therapy for people who are in a position that they cannot get it on their own. So that's the long-term goal, to cover it all. But that's been a huge eye-opener for me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Privilege and access is definitely something that, to white men speaking, obviously, like oftentimes we're blind to the privilege that we have in lots of different ways. And privilege is a broad word and speaks to lots of different things. But you're right. Like a lot of there's more need than there is access to the care that people require.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to loop back to the sort of spiritual side of things. One of the things that I often ask near the end of an interview is just more a broad question of where are you now when it comes to elements of either spirituality or Christianity, and given all of the experiences you've had personally. With healing and sort of having this understanding that a lot of evangelical Christianity stood in the way of your healing. Yeah. How do you relate to that part of life now? And I'm not trying to lead you and saying that I like to say is wholeness over holiness. I care more that people are whole no matter where that leads them. I still think it's an interesting question, and it's a good one to ask and hear where you've landed, just because, again, speaking, as you said, to someone who's in the same position you were 10 or 11 years
Sure.
ago. So how do you approach that part of life, or what is your relationship to that, where you are now?
You might not like my answer.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
My answer is I don't know and I don't care.
That's totally valid. That's absolutely valid.
I had a conversation recently where I get a lot of hate from evangelicals. They're just out of the blue, where they feel they don't have the ability to look and say, holy shit, all of these people have been wounded by a religion that I participate in. That makes me curious. Instead, it's like, you guys are all worthless and you're disgusting, and here's the Bible verses to prove it. And it's like, okay, well, that's really powerful. I want to be like you. It's just, it is what it is. People ask all the time, what do you believe now? And what I always say is that the reason I won't answer that question is because Christians especially need to know that there's still something in me that identifies with what they identify with, or they cannot trust what I have to say. And I want to go back to the days where politics and religion are kind of off the table, and people have their own sense of privacy and awareness based on their life experience. Because the reality is, like, everybody believes what they believe based on what they've been exposed to. So all I can say is I've been exposed to a lot, and I'm so, so grateful. And I believe that there's so much good in this world that we haven't tapped into. Beyond that, I just don't want to tell people what I believe. Like, listen, man, there are certain days where I'm not sure, but what I am sure of is that I don't know and I don't care.
Yeah, that is a totally valid answer, and I would absolutely affirm that. For me personally, I just had a similar thought recently, that a statement of non-belief feels almost as binding as a statement of belief to me. Like, at this point, like, how much time do you have? I'll tell you what I think about different theologies, but not knowing and not caring is absolutely valid, and I think it's especially valid for people that come from this walk of life, this religious background, because you were forced to care. Like, either you were highly motivated to care just innately, or you were forced to care externally. It's a shit show either way. But But it's totally valid to take a breather and not engage that part of life for
And
a
I
while.
think too, like when I want to be super, super clear about this one piece. I believe evangelical Christianity is dangerous. I believe it's bullshit. I believe that it is the utter waste of time. You can blast that on like the highest volume. I want to be very, very clear about that. And these are the points that I have with that. At 6 years old, I was taught because I had a high grade fever. We did not have insurance. So I was hallucinating and I was led to Christ because I was taught at that point there was a heaven or a hell because I was asking my mother, what happens if I die tonight? And that's when I learned about a heaven or a hell. No 6 year old, I don't care if we were on a playground and they were giving me cotton candy and thousands of dollars. No 6 year old, no 10-year old, no 20-year old should ever hear about a concept of hell. When our brains are not developed, we can't fully process what that means from a cognitive level, but then taught, make this decision or hear your consequences. That is disgusting. Right. That is just, that's appalling. And yet I believed it. I believed it for so long, but I looked at that as one of the most abusive things. And I think, this speaks volumes. There was a report that just came out in 2018 that they did I can't remember the name of the company. I posted about it a couple of days ago. They did a survey for the top 100 largest, most influential evangelical churches in the country to find out of those 100, how many are affirming. Number was 0.
Right. Was it Church Clarity? Church Clarity. Yeah.
I'm just to the point now where it's just like, guys, the LGBTQ community and women who have had abortions have taken your wrath and been your scapegoats for so damn long while you sit back and you ignore all the bullshit right in front of your face that we're all addressing. And
right.
So I want to be super clear about how I feel about evangelical Christianity.
No. I mean, this is the show for people that have left evangelicalism. So you're totally good to go there. You're not going to find an evangelical apologist.
No confusion on my part there at all.
Yeah.
But as far as the rest, it's there's just so much beauty in life that I'm exploring and experiencing, and I love it.
Right, and that's a great answer. So, well, Nate, I thank you so much for sharing all that you have this evening. Where can people find your work? Where can they find you online or elsewhere?
Okay, so everything is The Other Side of Saved. That's the blog, podcast, and that's Instagram. And then my coaching practice is called Story Connect Coaching. And I have, I can do individual coaching. I've got a 6-month program on there and just introduce groups. They're private groups with up to 10 people each. Everything is done online, and it's me facilitating healthy conversations. The 3 topics we're doing right now is religious trauma, LGBTQ support, meaning someone who is closeted, just recently out, or someone who's an ally. And then another group that I'm doing that I'm very excited about is survivors of male sexual abuse. So those are the 3 that are operated right now. And it's powerful, man, to just have people come together and then everyone's connected, and I just facilitate the conversations. So yeah, any coaching that someone would be interested in, they can find me through storyconnectcoaching.com. Everything else is The Other Side of Saved.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate, for joining me.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.